Helen met Oliver McKinley in her third year at the geology department. She was sitting at the second desk, concentrating on Professor Richardson's lecture on crystal lattices, when the door creaked open. The late student, with his bag slung casually over his shoulder, glanced distractedly around the lecture hall. "Mr. McKinley, I'm glad you decided to join us after all. I hope you'll be able to make it on time next time," the professor said, tapping his pointer emphatically on the desk. Oliver smiled unabashedly and sat down in the empty seat next to Helen. He smelled of coffee and October rain. Taking out his worn notebook, he leaned over to his neighbor. "Can I see what I missed?" Helen silently pushed her notes over. Latecomers always annoyed her, especially self-confident ones like this McKinley. She tried to concentrate on the lecture but couldn't help noticing how quickly he sketched diagrams, sometimes pausing to study the details. After class, Oliver handed her a folded sheet of paper. "I added a couple of points from the last lecture to your notes. There was an interesting connection to today's topic." He paused. "Listen, how about we go to a cafe? It's my treat to apologize for bothering you." Helen was about to decline. She didn't like her study schedule being disrupted by spontaneous plans. But there was something charmingly sincere about his offer, without the usual student flirting. They talked for 2 hours in a small coffee shop across from the university. Oliver talked about his passion for mineralogy, his summer expeditions with his geologist father, and how he collected rocks as a child. He spoke enthusiastically, constantly pulling out his notebook to sketch another diagram or formula. Helen found herself liking his enthusiasm, the same enthusiasm she felt when talking about gemology. "You know, I think every stone has its own story. You just have to know how to read it." Oliver tapped his pencil on the table. Like a detective who pieces together a crime from clues, a geologist can tell you what a mineral has been through over millions of years. "I prefer to look at the future of a stone," Helen smiled. "To imagine what it will be like after it's cut, how its beauty will be revealed in a piece of jewelry." "So you're a romantic." "More of a practical person. I just believe that beauty should be functional." Their conversation was interrupted by the bell. The next class was starting. As he gathered his things, Oliver asked, "You're taking Professor Jameson's elective class on crystallography, right?" "Yes. On Tuesdays and Thursdays." "Great. See you tomorrow then. I was just about to sign up." Helen didn't immediately realize she was smiling as she recalled this conversation on her way to her next lecture. There was something special about Oliver. He wasn't just another cute student, but someone who was truly passionate about what he did. He did show up for the elective, and this time he was on time. He sat down next to her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After class, they went to the coffee shop again, and it gradually became their tradition to discuss lectures, argue about methods of mineral research, and share their plans for the future. Oliver wasn't as sloppy as he had seemed at first. He just often stayed late in the lab studying samples and then overslept. His passion for science was impressive. He could talk about his research for hours, and his notes were more like scientific treatises. By the end of the semester, they were studying for exams together. Helen liked how Oliver could explain complex things in simple terms, how his eyes lit up when he talked about geology. And he admired her attention to detail and ability to see the practical application of theoretical knowledge. "Can you believe I used to think jewelry was just about making pretty things?" Oliver confessed one day. "You've opened my eyes to the fact that it's a whole science, the engineering of beauty, if you will." "A lot of people think that," Helen shrugged. "But to create something truly valuable, you need to understand the nature of the stone, its structure, its optical properties. A jeweler is both a scientist and an artist." They spent more and more time together outside of the university. They walked around campus and went to the Mineralogical Museum, where Oliver seemed to know every exhibit. Helen showed him her small collection of precious stones, which she had started collecting in school. It was a friendship between two passionate people that quietly grew into something more. They both felt it, but they didn't rush things. They enjoyed just being together, sharing their thoughts and making plans for a future where science and beauty would intertwine. Spring came early that year. They were sitting on a bench in the university courtyard surrounded by cherry blossoms. Oliver was talking about his upcoming summer expedition when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at Helen as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You know, you're like an Alexandrite," he said unexpectedly, "just as multifaceted. And you also change depending on the light. Sometimes you're a serious scientist, sometimes a romantic with a sparkle in your eyes." It was the most unusual declaration of love imaginable, and the most sincere. Helen laughed, but her heart was filled with warmth. She realized she had fallen in love with his mind, his passion for science, his unique view of the world, and with the way he saw her. After college, Oliver got a job at a geological laboratory, and Helen started working at the university's Mineral Research Center. They often had lunch together at a small cafe near the campus, sharing news and discussing their research. One day, Oliver took a small box out of his pocket. "Remember you told me about engagement ring traditions? That a diamond isn't the only worthy choice?" He opened the box. On a velvet cushion lay a ring with an alexandrite in an elegant setting. "I thought, maybe we could try writing our own story." Helen stared at the play of light in the stone for a long time. The alexandrite changed color from pale green to purple, reminding her of their first conversation about multifacetedness. The wedding was modest, in a city park, surrounded by the first greenery of spring. Helen wore a simple white dress and no jewelry except her engagement ring. Oliver couldn't take his eyes off her. After the ceremony, they did not go on a honeymoon, but on a geological expedition. It seemed the most natural choice for both of them. At first, they lived in a rented apartment near the university. In the evenings, they would sit in their small kitchen surrounded by books and mineral samples. Oliver was working on his dissertation on the formation of crystal structures in volcanic rocks. Helen helped him with his research while developing her own project on methods of identifying precious stones. Their married life was a continuation of the friendship that had begun at university. The same passionate conversations, joint research, and understanding without words. They bought an old house on the outskirts of the city, small, but with a spacious study where they kept their mineral collection and library. Helen set up a workshop in the basement for working with stones. "Do you know what I dream of?" she said one day, sorting through samples for her next study. "Opening my own jewelry store. Not just a store, but a place where every piece of jewelry has its own story, where we can select stones to suit a person's character and create something truly special." Oliver supported this idea as he did all her endeavors. They began to save money and make plans. Helen took on additional orders for stone appraisal and studied the intricacies of jewelry making. And then Shanna Darling appeared in their laboratory. She came to work as a junior research assistant, a tall blonde with delicate features and the light step of a dancer. Shanna specialized in spectral analysis of minerals and quickly became part of the team. She had a way of charming people. She spoke softly, listened attentively, and always found the right words. "You have an amazing collection," she said when she first visited their home for a traditional dinner for laboratory staff. "Oliver, I read your article on new methods of analyzing inclusions in crystals. It's a revolutionary approach." Helen noticed how her husband perked up and began talking about his research. Shanna listened with genuine interest and asked insightful questions. She really knew her stuff. It wasn't just flattery. Gradually, Shanna became a frequent guest at their home. She and Oliver were working on a joint project and often stayed late at the lab. Helen was happy that her husband had found a kindred spirit. She herself had recently become more interested in the practical side of working with stones than in theoretical research. Shenna has an amazingly subtle feel for the structure of crystals, Oliver said. You know, she suggested a completely new approach to analyzing impurities. We could make a breakthrough in this area. Helen nodded, lost in her thoughts about the future of the shop. She didn't notice the change in her husband's tone when he talked about Shanna, or the way his eyes lit up. Or maybe she didn't want to notice. Their dinners together became increasingly rare. Oliver often stayed late at work. When he came home, he smelled of unfamiliar perfumes, but Helen convinced herself it was just a coincidence. They still discussed research, but more and more often it was monologues, each talking about their own thing, not hearing the other. Shenna continued to visit, now without an invitation. She brought mineral samples, magazines with articles and some charts. Helen increasingly felt like a stranger in her own home. Once, she walked into the study and saw Shenna and Oliver leaning over the microscope, their shoulders touching. There was nothing wrong with that, just colleagues doing their jobs. But something about their posture, the way they froze when they heard Helen's footsteps, made her heart sink. She began to spend more time in her workshop, working on sketches for future jewelry designs. Oliver rarely came down there now, saying that the dust from working with stones aggravated his allergies. That had never been a problem before. "How about a romantic dinner this weekend?" Helen suggested one day. "We haven't gone out together in a long time." "I'm sorry, honey. Shenna and I are at an important stage of our research. I need to get the material ready for the conference." Helen looked at his reflection in the polished surface of the ring she was working on. The alexandrite in her engagement ring now showed its purple facet more often, as if warning her of something. But she still didn't want to believe the obvious. In her desk drawer, Helen came across some old greeting cards. She and Oliver had collected them, signing them for each other on every holiday. The last one was dated last year. She remembered that day. Oliver had forgotten their anniversary for the first time and later bought a card at the nearest store and hastily wrote a few lines. The lab consumed all his time. Helen understood the importance of research. She herself could once spend days on end in her workshop, polishing another stone. But lately, something had changed. Oliver seemed distant, withdrawn. At dinner, he was silent, buried in his tablet, or answered questions distractedly. Sometimes Helen thought he simply couldn't hear her. He was so deep in thought. "Are you okay?" she asked one day, noticing her husband rereading the same page of a report for the third time. "Huh? Yeah, just tired. It's a complicated project, a lot of data to analyze." He rubbed his nose. "Shanna thinks we're on the verge of an important discovery. We just need to interpret the results correctly." Shanna again. That name was now heard in their home more often than Helen's own. Shanna suggested, Shanna noticed, Shanna thinks. Her colleague had become an invisible presence, a ghost that was gradually filling the space of their lives. Helen tried to remain calm. After all, it was just work. Just a successful collaboration between two passionate people. She immersed herself in developing her project, researching the jewelry market, meeting with suppliers, designing the future store. But the little things kept piling up. Oliver started staying late at the lab more often. His phone was always face down now. He started going to the gym, something he used to consider a waste of time. He bought a new cologne and changed his style of dress. "I just want to look more presentable," he explained in response to Helen's surprised look. "We have an important conference coming up, and I'm going to be giving a presentation. Shanna says that appearance is also important for your career." Shanna now came in not only with work-related questions. She brought homemade baked goods to brighten up the long evenings at work. She treated Oliver to special varieties of tea. Once, Helen caught them in the kitchen. Shanna was teaching him how to brew oolong tea properly, standing uncomfortably close to him. Another time, she brought tickets to a classical music concert. Oliver mentioned that he likes Chopin, she smiled, and I happen to have an extra ticket. Helen wanted to remind her that her husband couldn't stand classical music, that she was the one who took him to concerts at the beginning of their relationship. But Oliver had already agreed to go. They spent fewer and fewer weekends together. Oliver always had excuses: urgent work, an important meeting, preparations for a conference. Helen immersed herself in her projects, trying not to think about the fact that her husband was coming home after midnight more and more often, with a faint scent of another woman's perfume lingering on him. Strange items began to appear in their home: a woman's hair clip on the floor in the study, a stranger's cup in the dishwasher, a note in unfamiliar handwriting among the work papers. Little things that could be explained away as accidents. Helen diligently came up with these explanations, convincing herself that everything was fine. One evening, she went down to the workshop and stared at her engagement ring for a long time. The alexandrite glimmered dimly in the light of the desk lamp. Helen remembered how Oliver had chosen this stone and talked about its unique properties. Somewhere upstairs, the front door slammed. Her husband was home late again. She heard his footsteps, the sound of the shower running, the rustling of papers in his study. Lately, they had hardly spoken to each other. Oliver was working more and more on weekends, and when he was home, he sat in his study with the door closed. Helen tried to remember the last time they had dinner together, talked about something other than work, made plans together. She began to notice the looks of her colleagues: sympathetic, understanding. It was as if everyone around her knew something they were keeping from her. At work, Oliver and Shanna were professional, but sometimes Helen caught them talking quietly in the hallway, stopping when she appeared. The second pillow disappeared from their bedroom. Oliver began sleeping in his office more often, explaining that he was working late. His things gradually moved there too. First his work clothes, then his books and personal belongings. It was as if he was preparing for something, creating his own separate space. Helen found receipts from restaurants where they had never been together. She overheard a phone conversation. Oliver was speaking unusually softly, calling someone sweet. She noticed how he hid his phone when she entered the room. It all added up to a picture she refused to see. Each time she found excuses, convincing herself that it was just a coincidence. Work, stress, fatigue. Nothing more. They were just going through a difficult period. They just needed to wait it out, give each other space, and focus on their own lives. But the reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It manifested itself in little things: forgotten anniversaries, missed calls, unspoken words. In the way Oliver now looked through her as if she had become invisible. In the way he lit up when Shanna appeared. In new habits and interests that had previously been foreign to him. Their home was filled with silence. It seeped through the cracks, settled as dust on the shelves, and hung in the air along with unspoken words. Helen found herself going down to the workshop more and more often, where the silence was familiar and productive. There, among the stones and tools, she felt more confident. Stones didn't lie, pretend, or change their nature. It was drizzling outside when Helen returned home after a long day at work. The hallway was unusually empty. Oliver's coat was gone, as were his favorite shoes. The kitchen lights were off, and there was no smell of coffee, which he usually brewed in the evenings. Her first thought was that he had stayed late at the lab. It had been common lately. Helen put her bag on the kitchen table and took out her phone. Several missed calls from a friend, a reminder about a meeting with a stone supplier, advertisements. Not a word from Oliver. On the table lay a piece of paper folded in four. Her husband's handwriting was hasty, nervous, unlike his usual neat slant. "I'm sorry. I'm leaving. It's better this way. Don't try to find me." Helen read the note 3 times before the meaning began to sink in. The desk drawers in the study were pulled out and there were gaps between the books on the shelves. He had taken the most important ones. The wardrobe in the bedroom was wide open, unusually spacious. An old sweater she had given him last Christmas lay on the floor. For some reason, she opened his laptop and checked their joint account. It was empty. All the savings they had been putting aside for her future shop were gone. There was only a small amount left on the card, as if it were a handout to help her get by for the first few months. His towel was still hanging in the bathroom, and an almost empty bottle of cologne stood on the shelf. Helen mechanically gathered the scattered items and put them in a bag. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the cracked tile in the corner. They had been meaning to replace it for a long time. The phone rang several times. She didn't answer. Then a message came from Shanna. "I hope you understand. We didn't mean to hurt you." Helen deleted it without finishing. Fragments of memories swirled in her head. How Oliver had hurriedly gotten ready for work that morning. How strange his bye had sounded, as if he were rehearsing. How he had brought boxes into the house a week ago, supposedly for old documents. How, methodically, day after day, he had prepared to leave and she hadn't noticed, hadn't wanted to notice. The front door creaked, and out of old habit she started to open it. Standing on the doorstep was her neighbor from downstairs, holding a bowl of apple pie. "I saw Oliver taking his things out this morning. I thought I'd drop by." Helen thanked her and closed the door. The smell of cinnamon made her feel nauseous. A cup of half-drunk coffee was still standing in the kitchen, his last breakfast here. She poured it down the sink and watched the dark liquid swirl down the drain. She called work and said she was sick. Her voice sounded calm, ordinary, as if it really was just a cold. Her boss grunted understandingly. Apparently, the rumors had already spread. The phone rang again. Her mother. She asked if it was true. Helen cut the conversation short. She turned off the phone and drew the curtains. She sat down in the armchair in the living room where they used to spend their evenings. Twilight was falling, but she didn't turn on the lights. In a box on the dresser lay her engagement ring with an alexandrite. She had taken it off a week ago so it wouldn't get in the way of her work on a new project. The stone glinted dimly in the semi-darkness. "They say that alexandrite brings bad luck if you wear it when it's not meant for you." She smiled at her own thoughts. Now she was looking for signs where there were none. The night passed in a daze. In the morning, she mechanically got ready for work. Habit was stronger than pain. In the lab, people studiously averted their eyes and whispered behind her back. Someone left a chocolate bar on her desk. Silent sympathy. She worked methodically like a machine, checking samples, filling out the log, answering emails. At lunchtime, I went down to the cafeteria and sat down at a table in the far corner. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Shenna, who quickly turned into another corridor. In the evening, I stood at the door of my own house for a long time, not daring to go in. It was quiet and empty inside. The answering machine was flashing red, several messages. She didn't listen to them. In the bedroom, she made the bed, out of habit on both sides, and then caught herself. The pillow still smelled of his cologne. She took off the pillowcase and put it in the washing machine. She sat down on the bed, staring at the empty half. In the morning, she found a crumpled receipt from a jewelry store in the pocket of his old sweater. He had bought Shene a necklace a month before he left. It was from their joint savings, which they had set aside for her dream. She carefully smoothed out the piece of paper and put it in a box with her engagement ring. She began methodically gathering his things, books, documents, accidentally forgotten trinkets. She put them in boxes and labeled them. Her hands moved on their own. Her head remained empty. Only when she found their old photo album did she freeze. In the pictures they were happy, or did they think they were happy? She picked up the phone and dialed his number. Rings. Answering machine. The subscriber's phone is turned off or out of range. Of course, it was silly to hope. The frosty morning began with a meeting at which Helen stared intently at her notebook while Shanna and Oliver presented the results of their research. Their voices merged into a monotonous hum, and her pencil drew meaningless patterns in the margins. After the presentation, her colleagues applauded quietly, and someone whistled admiringly. The results were truly impressive. "Are you okay?" Martha, the lab manager, held her back after the meeting. "Maybe you should take some time off, relax?" "I'm fine," Helen said, gathering her papers into a folder. "I'm managing. No one would blame you if you—" "Really, everything's fine," Helen said, struggling to fit the folder into her bag. Martha paused, looking at her former student, now one of her best employees. Then she gently placed her hand on Helen's shoulder. "You know, sometimes leaving doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes it means moving on." That evening, Helen sat in her workshop for a long time, sorting through samples of stones. She remembered some of them from her student days. She and Oliver had found this quartz on their first expedition together, and he had given her this opal on their 5th wedding anniversary. Stories embedded in a crystalline lattice. In the morning, she placed her resignation letter on Martha's desk. Martha signed it silently, then took a business card out of the drawer. "My friend owns a chain of pawn shops. They need a good appraiser. It's not scientific work, of course, but—" Helen took the card. The Golden Lion Pawn Shop was located in the business center, an hour's drive from her home. The owner, a heavy-set man with a shrewd gaze, conducted the interview right in the sales room, among the jewelry displays. "So, you're a gemologist? Interesting. Show me what you can do," he said, taking several stones out of a safe. Helen methodically examined the samples through a magnifying glass, describing their characteristics and giving their approximate value. She set one aside. "This is a synthetic sapphire, although the documents say it's natural. It's a high-quality fake, but there are some characteristic inclusions." "Accepted," the owner smiled. "Be here tomorrow at 9. Working at the pawn shop was unlike anything she had done before. No research or scientific articles, just quick appraisals, haggling, and paperwork. But the pay was enough to rent an apartment in the neighborhood. The real estate agent showed her several options. Helen chose a small studio on the 12th floor, bright, with a panoramic window and a built-in kitchen. From the window, she could see the business center where she now worked. In the evenings, the skyscrapers lit up, and the city looked like a scattering of gems on black velvet. The move took only a day. Surprisingly, she didn't need many things: books, clothes, tools for working with stones, a few photographs. Not with Oliver, old ones from her student days. She sold the rest along with the house. The money would come in handy for a new start. The days flew by at the pawn shop. Helen quickly learned to identify the type of customer at first glance. This woman in designer clothes brought in a ring to pay off her credit card debt, and this elderly man pawned the same watch every month to make ends meet until retirement. "You have a rare gift," the owner said one day, watching her work with a customer. "You don't just appraise things, you see their history." In the evenings, she would walk around the city, studying the jewelry store windows. She sketched jewelry designs and calculated estimates. Her dream of starting her own business had not disappeared. It was simply put on hold, like a precious stone in a safe, waiting for its moment. On weekends, she would go down to a small cafe on the first floor. They made excellent coffee and never asked unnecessary questions. Sometimes her mother would call. She would talk about the weather, the neighbors, carefully avoiding the subject of Oliver. Only once did she give in. "Maybe you should find him. Talk to him?" "Why?" Helen stirred her cold coffee. "He made his choice." People often brought wedding rings to the pawn shop, especially on Mondays after a wild weekend. Helen learned to treat them like ordinary jewelry: metal, stones, carats. No stories, just the facts on the appraisal card. One day during her lunch break, she went to the neighboring shopping center and came across a sign, "Store space for rent." She stopped and looked at the empty window. The location was good, lots of foot traffic, a respectable neighborhood. She wrote down the real estate agent's phone number, not knowing why. In the evening, she took out her old jewelry sketches and calculations for the future store. The numbers had changed. Rent in this area was higher than she had planned, but there were also more opportunities. She sat down to write a new business plan and worked until dawn. Someone brought an antique emerald necklace to the pawn shop. An elderly woman in a worn coat took it out of a velvet case with trembling hands. Helen carefully took the jewelry and held it up to the table lamp. The emerald seemed to come to life in the light, a deep green color, almost without inclusions. The setting was delicate work from the beginning of the last century. "It's from my grandmother," the woman said nervously, fiddling with a button on her coat. "She danced at the Imperial Theater. They say it was a gift from some prince." The story sounded implausible, but the stones were real. Helen wrote the amount on a piece of paper. The woman paled, muttered something about urgent debts, and agreed. After she left, the necklace went into the safe, and Helen sat over the documents for a long time, remembering her grandmother's tales of the imperial family's jewels. Just before closing time, an elderly man entered the pawn shop. His gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and his hands bore traces of chemical burns. He took several loose stones out of a worn briefcase. Helen was wary. Stones like these usually had a dubious origin. "Hector Miller, Jewelry Workshop on Pine Street," he said, handing her his business card. "I was recommended to you as a good specialist. I need an independent appraisal." Helen examined the stones through a magnifying glass. Sapphires of various cuts, several small diamonds, all clean, well cut, an unusual order for a pawn shop. "Interesting work," Helen put down the magnifying glass, "especially this sapphire with its unusual cut. Such an approach is rare." "My design," Miller smiled. "I'm trying to find new ways to reveal the natural beauty of the stone. You know, every crystal is unique. You just have to see its potential." They talked until evening. Miller told her about his workshop and showed her photos of his work. Helen hung on his every word. For the first time in a long time, she had met someone who talked about stones with the same passion she did. "Come by sometime," Miller said, putting the stones back in their case. "I'll show you my workshop and the process. Maybe we'll find we have something in common." The next day, a girl came into the pawn shop with an engagement ring. Her eyes were teary, and she seemed nervous. Helen took the ring as usual, trying not to think about her alexandrite, hidden in a box at home. "You haven't taken good care of it," she remarked, examining the scratches on the metal. "Platinum doesn't like rough handling." "What difference does it make now?" The girl sniffed. "It's useless anyway." In the evenings, Helen wandered through jewelry store websites, studying prices and assortments. She sketched jewelry designs, simple lines, unusual color combinations. At work, she increasingly found herself thinking about how she could rework the jewelry she had designed, give it a new life. One day, she decided to visit Miller's workshop. It was an old building in a quiet side street with a sign that was barely visible from the street. Inside, it smelled of metal and wax, and tools glinted on the workbenches. The master himself was working on a ring, bent over a lamp. "Ah, Helen," he looked up. "Come in. I'm just finishing an interesting piece." Hector Miller's workshop became a second home for Helen. In the evenings, after work at the pawn shop, she would come here to immerse herself in the secrets of jewelry making. Hector turned out to be a demanding teacher. No allowances, no compromises when working with metal and stones. "Jewelry making does not tolerate approximation," he said, showing her how to hold a soldering iron correctly. "Every movement must be precise, every bend deliberate." Helen learned to feel the metal, its elasticity, malleability, character. Silver is capricious but obedient in skilled hands. Gold demands respect and precision. Platinum forgives mistakes but remembers everyone. The first ring she made on her own turned out crooked with an uneven seam. Hector looked at it for a long time, turning it under the lamp. Not bad for a start. But here and here, he pointed to the flaws. The metal is overheated, and here the seam is too thick. Redo it. Helen redid it over and over again until her movements became confident and the seams invisible. Hector taught her not only technique, but also an understanding of jewelry as a whole, from idea to realization. Any piece of jewelry starts with a stone, he explained, taking another uncut crystal out of the safe. You have to see its essence, understand what shape will reveal its beauty. Only then can you think about the setting. Unusual orders often came into the workshop. An elderly lady brought in an antique brooch with a bent pin, a memento of her great-grandmother. Hector carefully straightened the metal and repaired the clasp without damaging the patina of age. A young man ordered wedding rings with a special ornament, a family pattern passed down from generation to generation. Helen absorbed not only technical skills but also this special attitude toward work, attention to detail, respect for tradition, and an understanding of the value of each order. Gradually, she began to notice changes in her work at the pawn shop. Now she evaluated jewelry not only by the value of the stones and metal, but also by the quality of the workmanship and the subtleties of the craft. "You have a knack for this," Hector remarked one day as he watched her work on a complex sapphire setting. "You can teach a lot, but some things you either have or you don't." In the evenings, they often talked about the future of jewelry. Hector talked about changing trends, new technologies, and the importance of maintaining a balance between tradition and modernity. You see, nowadays many people chase after fashion and flashy designs, but true beauty lies in harmony between the stone, the metal, and the design. Jewelry should reveal the character of its owner, not scream about itself. Helen began sketching her own collection, simple, elegant lines, unusual combinations of stones. Hector looked them over, occasionally making notes in pencil. "Interesting idea, but think about how to secure the stones. You need a more reliable setting here." Gradually, she began to notice a new habit in herself, looking at the jewelry worn by passers-by, noting the merits and flaws of the work. In jewelry store windows, she now saw not only prices, but also the quality of workmanship and the thoughtfulness of the design. One day, a woman came into the workshop with an unusual request: to melt down several old pieces of jewelry into one new piece. Helen helped Hector with this work, and for the first time truly understood what it meant to give new life to old things. From a scattering of tarnished rings and pendants, an elegant necklace was born. Simple at first glance, but with many subtle details. "That's what real work is," Hector said when the satisfied customer left. "Not just repairing or copying, but creating something new while preserving the memory of the old." At moments like these, Helen felt especially keenly that she had found her calling. Working with metal and stones was calming, helped her gather her thoughts, and gave her a sense of purpose. Every evening she left the workshop with new knowledge and new ideas. Hector increasingly entrusted her with independent orders, first simple repairs, then more complex work. Her hands learned to feel the metal, her eyes to see the potential of the stone, and her mind to combine the two into a single whole. The small room on the first floor of the old house on Maple Street smelled of fresh paint. Helen arranged the display cases, strict lines of glass and metal, soft lighting. Hector helped with the workshop equipment in the back room, occasionally commenting on the placement of the tools. "The most important thing in our business is the right light," he said. adjusting the lamp above the workbench, so you can see the stone in all its glory. The money from selling the house and her savings from working at the pawn shop were barely enough for the down payment on the space and basic equipment. But Helen wasn't afraid to start small. There weren't many pieces in the display cases yet, a few pieces created under Hector's guidance and a couple of restored antiques. She thought long and hard about the sign. No flashy letters or gold embossing, just a simple inscription, Reflections, in black letters on frosted glass. Inside the display case, spotlights flickered, creating a play of light on the facets of the stones. Her first customer was a young woman with a ring she had inherited from her grandmother. It was an antique piece, but the stone had become cloudy and the setting had lost its shape. Helen examined the jewelry for a long time, estimating the amount of work involved. "This needs a complete restoration," she said, showing the customer the problem areas. "The stone will have to be repolished and the facets restored. The setting can be saved, but it will need to be reinforced. It will take some time." The woman hesitated, glancing at the price tag. Helen told her the history of the ring, identifying the period and the workshop from its distinctive details. The customer left, taking the jewelry with her, but returned the next day. Such an understanding of the value of a family heirloom is rare. Gradually, regular customers began to appear. Some came for repairs, others were looking for unusual jewelry. Helen treated each order as special, putting not only her skill, but also her understanding into her work. One day, an elderly gentleman entered the shop. Gray hair, an expensive suit, an attentive gaze. He looked at the display cases for a long time, then took a case with a brooch out of his pocket. "This is the last piece of jewelry my father made before the war," he said, handing the case to Helen. "I would like to have it restored, but only if you truly understand the value of such things." The brooch was an old-school masterpiece, a complex pattern of platinum and gold, with diamonds of different cuts artfully selected. Helen explained the technique used to make it, identified the workshop, and pointed out the unique details of the work. The gentleman listened with growing interest. "You remind me of my father," he said finally. "He always said that every piece of jewelry has a story." This commission was a turning point. The gentleman turned out to be a collector, and his recommendations brought in new clients. Helen gradually developed her own style, combining classic techniques with modern design. An apprentice appeared in the workshop, a young man with bright eyes and nimble hands. Helen taught him as Hector had once taught her, without leniency, but with understanding and respect for the material. In the evenings, after closing the shop, she worked on her own collection. Simple but expressive forms, unusual combinations of stones. Each piece of jewelry told a story about the nature of the stone, the skill of the craftsmanship, and the person for whom it was created. Hector often stopped by to check on her work, offer advice, or just talk about new ideas. He watched with approval as his student's business developed and her skills grew. "You know what's most important?" he said once, looking at a new display. "You're not just making jewelry, you're creating beauty that lasts." The upscale Ritz Plaza shopping center sparkled in the morning sun. Helen stood in front of an empty space on the second floor, next to boutiques of famous brands. Large windows overlooked the city's central square, and a glass dome filled the space with diffused light. The previous tenant moved out a month ago. The real estate agent tapped her heels on the marble floor. "There used to be an Italian shoe store here. As you can see, the space is completely ready for renovation." Helen ran her hand along the wall, imagining how to arrange the display cases, where to put the workbenches, how to organize the space. The space was 3 times larger than her current store, and the rent was 5 times higher. "A jewelry salon will require significant remodeling," the real estate agent said, opening a folder of documents. "Enhanced security, special lighting, but we have trusted contractors." Her phone vibrated in her pocket, A message from a student. An antique necklace had been brought to the store for appraisal. Helen asked the real estate agent to leave the documents for her to review and hurried back. An elderly lady with a heavy velvet case was waiting for her in the store. On the black velvet lay a necklace made by a famous French workshop in the early 19th century, a rare example of jewelry art. "It's a family heirloom," the lady said, nervously fingering her pearl earrings. "But maintaining a house like this," she waved her hand toward the mansion across the street, "requires money." Helen named her price, and the lady raised her eyebrows in surprise. Other shops offered half as much, because they didn't understand the value of the work. "Look at these fastenings. They're handmade using a unique technique. You only find this in jewelry from this workshop." By evening, the necklace was the property of the store, and an impressive sum appeared in the account, the first installment from the buyer Helen had found among collectors. A few days later, she was back in the empty Ritz Plaza space, but now with an interior designer. He made notes in his notebook offering solutions: special lighting for each display case, a separate room for exclusive jewelry, and a cozy area for working with customers. "And here, you can make a workshop with a glass partition," the designer pointed to the far end of the room. "Customers like to see the work process." The move took almost a month. Helen personally supervised every stage, from installing safes to adjusting the lighting. Hector helped with the workshop equipment, grunting approvingly at the sight of the new tools. The opening was low-key. Helen didn't like fanfare. One day, the doors of the new salon simply opened to visitors. The display cases sparkled with precious stones, and in the back of the room, craftsmen worked quietly, creating new jewelry. The first customer was the lady with the necklace. She brought a friend who needed to have some old jewelry redone. Others followed suit. Word of the master, who understood the value of antique items, quickly spread among certain circles. Helen created a special atmosphere in the new store. There were no pushy salespeople or loud price tags. Each piece of jewelry had its own story, and each stone was chosen with special care. Customers came not just to buy. They came for the history, for the understanding, for the attitude toward things as something more than just merchandise. In the corner of the workshop stood an old workbench from the previous store. Helen wouldn't let it be replaced. Behind it, she continued to work on special orders as a reminder of where she had started. "You haven't changed," Hector remarked one day, watching her work on another piece of jewelry. "The same look you get when you look at a stone. It's as if you see something in it that others don't." Helen smiled without looking up from her work. The new shop offered more opportunities, more customers, more prestige. But the most important thing remained the same: the desire to create beauty that would outlive its creator. Spring rain drummed on the windows of Ritz Plaza as the shop door opened. Helen looked up from the gemstone catalog and froze. Oliver was standing in the doorway, and next to him was Shanna, clutching an umbrella to her chest. They didn't notice her behind the counter, looking at the display cases and talking quietly. Shanna adjusted the luxurious pearl necklace around her neck, and Oliver put his hand on her shoulder. They looked confident and successful, with their expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance. "Hello," Helen was surprised at her own calm voice. "How can I help you?" Oliver turned at the sound of her voice, and his confident smile froze. Shanna squinted, studying her former rival behind the glass counter. A heavy silence hung in the store. "Helen?" Oliver nervously tugged at his jacket. "You work here?" "I own this store," she said, raising her eyebrow slightly. "Would you like to buy something?" Shanna let out a short laugh. "What a coincidence. We were looking for a gift for my mother, but I think we'll look for something more prestigious place." "This isn't a place for poor people," Oliver smiled stiffly. "Let's go, dear." "You're right." Helen opened the catalog, deliberately not looking at them. My jewelry isn't for everyone, only for those who truly understand the value of real art. At that moment, Hector came out of the workshop, wiping his hands. Helen, I've finished the sapphire set for Mrs. Rockefeller. Would you like to see it? Oliver flinched as if he had been struck. Shanna grabbed his arm. Let's get out of here. I saw a wonderful shop a couple of blocks away. They left without saying goodbye. Helen watched them through the window. Shanna was talking excitedly, waving her arms. Oliver was huddled under the rain. Friends? Hector put the jewelry case on the counter. My ex-husband. Helen opened the case, examining the play of light in the sapphires. And his current wife.
Ah, Hector paused. You know, sometimes stones are like people. Some shine brightly but are hollow inside. Others reveal their beauty gradually with each new facet. Helen smiled, sincerely for the first time in the last hour. The polishing machine hummed softly in the workshop, and the rain painted patterns on the shop windows. Life went on, and it was beautiful in its simple complexity, like a perfectly cut crystal. In the evening, closing the shop, Helen took the box with the engagement ring out of the safe. The alexandrite still changed color under different lighting, but now this play of light seemed simply a beautiful natural phenomenon, nothing more. She locked the box back in the safe. It was time to let go of the past.
By nightfall, the rain had stopped. Helen walked to her car along the wet pavement, thinking about the new collection she had started to create. Jewelry inspired by the power of nature, imperfect but beautiful in its authenticity, like life itself, which doesn't always go according to plan but always gives you a chance to create something new. The lights in the shop windows flickered, reflecting in the puddles with multicolored sparks. Tomorrow would be a new day, with new customers and new stories, and each of them would be reflected in the precious facets she would create with her own hands. The university cafeteria was unusually quiet. Lunchtime was long past. Martha, Helen's former boss, stirred her cold coffee, searching for the right words. I thought long and hard about whether I should tell you, but you need to know. Their lab is about to close. The last project failed and funding has been cut. Helen broke off a piece of chocolate muffin but didn't eat it. Martha continued. Oliver made a huge mistake in his calculations. Shanna tried to cover it up, fudged the data. When everything came out, why did you decide to tell me? Because he's using your old research. He's trying to reproduce the methodology without understanding the details. It could be dangerous. Long evenings spent at the microscope, meticulous notes, carefully calculated formulas came to mind. Oliver had always considered this work too tedious and uninteresting. After meeting with Martha, Helen stopped by the supermarket. While waiting in line at the checkout, she noticed a magazine with a celebrity gossip section. On the cover was Shanna in a luxurious dress at some kind of reception. The article inside talked about their family's financial problems, the sale of their country house, and rumors surrounding a scientific scandal. In the evening, her mother called, "Did you hear? Oliver came to your father at the university and asked for help with a publication. Dad refused, saying he doesn't support plagiarism." Helen looked at the night city outside her apartment window. Somewhere out there, in another neighborhood, in another life, Oliver and Shanna were trying to salvage what they had left. She felt a strange emptiness, neither malice nor pity. A week later, Oliver showed up at the store again, alone without Shanna. He looked older, with gray temples and a dull gaze. He stared at the shop windows for a long time, not daring to speak. "Can I help you?" Helen didn't recognize her own voice, so cold and formal. "Helen, can we talk? I'm afraid now isn't a good time. I have customers." There were indeed several shoppers in the store. Oliver shifted from foot to foot, crumpling some papers in his hands. "Please, it's important. It's about your research." The one you took with the rest? She spoke quietly so as not to attract the attention of the other customers. Or the one you're trying to pass off as your own? Oliver turned pale. You know? Go away, Oliver, and don't come back. He stood there for another minute, then slowly headed for the exit. At the door, he turned around. I really loved you. I just got confused. Helen didn't answer. That evening, she took out an old flash drive with backup copies of her research. She spent several hours looking through the files, remembering the details of the experiments. In the morning, she sent an anonymous letter to the scientific committee with proof of her authorship and a warning about the dangers of misusing the methodology. A month later, a scandal erupted in scientific circles. Oliver's name was mentioned in connection with accusations of plagiarism and data falsification. Shanna filed for divorce. Helen didn't follow the details. She was too busy preparing a new exhibition of her jewelry designs. After sending the letter to the scientific committee, Helen couldn't settle down. In the evenings, she sat for hours in her empty shop, remembering the years of research, the carefully calculated formulas, the endless experiments. All of this was now being misused, dangerously. There was an uproar at the university. Colleagues were divided into two camps. Some supported Oliver, others demanded a thorough investigation. Martha called in a panic. Inspections had begun in the laboratory, and a commission was examining every document. Shanna appeared in the local news, giving interviews about the persecution of a talented scientist. An elegant suit, flawless makeup, a confident gaze into the camera. Only her fingers, nervously fingering a string of pearls, betrayed her state of mind. Oliver sent a letter, long, confused, full of excuses and requests for a meeting. Helen deleted it without reading it. Another came the next day, then another. He wrote about how he was backed into a corner, how Shanna was demanding more and more money, how creditors were threatening to take away his house. An elderly lady, a regular customer, came into the store. While Helen was showing her the new collection, the lady casually remarked, I saw your ex-husband at a restaurant yesterday. He was dining alone and looked terrible. They say his wife has filed for divorce. Helen said nothing, but that evening she turned on the local news. Shanna had indeed filed for divorce, demanding half of the property. Oliver contested the decision, claiming that most of the money had gone toward her luxurious lifestyle. A week later, he came back to the store, unshaven and wearing a wrinkled suit. Helen was just finishing with a customer when he appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry about the other day, he said quietly, looking at the floor. I shouldn't have come with Shanna. I shouldn't have said those things. Do you need anything? Helen pointedly checked the shop windows. Help me, please. You've always been smarter than me. If you talk to the committee, explain. Explain what? How you stole my research or how you faked the results. I didn't fake anything. I just adapted the methodology. Shanna said it would help get the grant. His voice took on a pleading tone. Helen remembered how he had spoken in exactly the same way at university when he hadn't finished his work on time. How he had charmed his teachers into giving him more time. Go, she said, pointing to the door, and don't come back, ever. He stood there for a moment, shifting from foot to foot, then slowly walked out. Helen locked the shop door and lowered the blinds. She sat down at her desk and took out her old notes. The events of the last few days seemed to have lifted a veil from the past. She could now clearly see how Oliver had always looked for the easy way out, how he hid behind other people, how he used them. In the evening, his mother called. Have you seen the news? Oliver has resigned. They say the commission found more violations. The empty university corridor echoed with footsteps. Helen was on her way to a meeting with the academic committee. They had requested a face-to-face discussion of her research. At the door to the conference room, she bumped into Shanna. She looked haggard, with dark circles under her eyes and her lips pressed tightly together. I hope you're happy, Shanna said, adjusting her purse with a trembling hand. "You've destroyed everything we've built." "What you destroyed yourselves," Helen said calmly, walking past her. The committee members were sitting in the hall, familiar faces, former colleagues, respected scientists. For 2 hours she answered questions, showed the original records, and explained her methodology. After the meeting, Professor Jenkins, her former research supervisor, approached her. "You know, I always thought it was strange that Oliver suddenly took up this field. It never interested him." In the evening, as Helen was closing the shop, Oliver appeared at the door again. This time he was sober, wearing a clean shirt and clean-shaven. "I came to apologize," he said quietly but firmly. "To truly apologize. I was wrong. About everything." Helen continued to check the alarm silently. Oliver shifted from foot to foot. "I've lost everything. My job, my reputation, my home. Shanna took my last savings and left for Europe. But you know what's worst? I've lost myself. Somewhere along the way, I stopped understanding who I am and what I want." "And what do you want now?" Helen finally turned to him. "To start over, honestly. No cheating or lying. To get back to real science." "And what does that have to do with me?" "You're the only person who has always seen through me, and the only one who can confirm that I'm capable of more." Helen shook her head. "No, Oliver. I won't be your safety net anymore. I won't vouch for your integrity. You have to prove yourself." "I understand," he lowered his head. "Just, can I come by sometimes? To talk? Like we used to, about science, about life?" "No." She locked the door. "Goodbye, Oliver." He stood on the sidewalk watching her walk to her car. In the rearview mirror his figure grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. At home, Helen took out an old photo album. Not the glossy one with wedding photos, but a worn one from her student days. Young faces, the laboratory, expeditions, Oliver with a microscope, her with rock samples, when everything was real. In the morning, a message came from Martha. The commission had completed its investigation. Oliver had been stripped of his academic degree. Shenna was ordered to return the grant. A short note appeared in the news. Another scientific scandal, a breach of ethics, falsification of results. Helen closed the news feed. The first customers were already coming into the store. It was time to get to work. Life went on, without drama or disruption, just flowing like a river around the rocks. The first spring flowers were blooming in the garden of her new house. Helen loved to spend her mornings here with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the city. The house stood on a hill overlooking the business center. Among the glass skyscrapers, she could see the Ritz Plaza building where her store was located. Much had changed over the past year. She had opened a second store in the suburbs, created a line of designer jewelry, and launched a training course for aspiring jewelers. Hector was now in charge of the workshop, training a new generation of craftsmen. The phone on the table vibrated, a message from her mother. Another attempt to tell her the news about Oliver. Helen deleted it without reading it. The past was in the past, like a closed book on a distant shelf. An unusual order awaited her at the store. A young couple wanted engagement rings with a special design. The girl took a sketch out of her purse. Simple lines, an unusual combination of metals. "We met at an art studio," she explained, "and we want the rings to reflect our story." Helen listened to their story, making notes in her notebook. These two glowed with that special light that only truly in love people have. She remembered that feeling, as if the whole world was created just for the two of them. After they left, she sat over her sketches for a long time. This couple's story deserved a special embodiment. Lately, Helen had noticed that each order was becoming a little story that she was helping to tell. In the evening, Martha stopped by. Now, they often met just as friends without mentioning the past or university. They sat in a cozy cafe discussing plans for the future. Martha was planning to retire and dreamed of traveling. "What about you?" she asked, stirring her tea. "What are your plans?" Helen thought for a moment. She had many plans: to expand her line of designer jewelry, open a jewelry school, write a book about the history of famous jewelry. But most importantly, she finally felt like she belonged. At home, sorting through her mail, she came across an invitation to a jewelry exhibition in Paris. The organizers asked her to give a lecture on contemporary trends in jewelry design. Helen smiled. Who would have thought that everything would turn out this way? The first magnolia blossomed in the garden, its huge white flowers glowing in the twilight. Helen stood at the window, looking down at the city below. Somewhere out there lived the people whose stories she helped tell through the jewelry she created. Somewhere out there was her past, but it no longer had any power over her present. She woke up early in the morning as usual. A new day lay ahead with new encounters and new stories, and she was ready for them. No longer the confused woman whose husband had left her for another woman, but a confident person who had found her way. In the shop, sketches for the new collection awaited her, as did meetings with suppliers and work on special orders. Life was full of plans and possibilities, and it was wonderful, just living, just working, just being herself. Helen smiled at her reflection in the shop window. The woman looking back at her knew her worth and where she was going. The future no longer frightened her. It beckoned with new horizons and possibilities.